that was a loud one. We are recording today on Mexican Independence Day, the 16th of September. Technically a holiday, so I'll expect twice as much pay as I usually get for this sort of podcast. That's the law. And the reason I was shocked just now was because a pair of fighter jets, just flew overhead on the way to fly over Mexico City's Central Square, El Zócalo, for the traditional military parade, somewhere between the American one and the Chinese one, I'd say.
With the important distinction that Mexico's Air Force is not quite up to the standard. But the spectacle is very grand.
And one of the biggest things that one is expected to do on Independence Day, or for El Grito, which is the big celebration the night before on the 15th, is to don your favorite traditional dress, eat a bunch of pozole, and, crucially, get completely sloshed on Mexico's favorite drink, which is rum and coke. that at least is that's what traditionally is drunk around my part of Mexico. What do you think, Tavo?
Well, actually, there was an article recently talking about how much tequila consumption grows specifically during September, and more importantly, during the 16th of September, because tequila is, of course, Mexico's most emblematic drink, if not the most emblematic symbol of Mexico, in Mexico and around the world.
It's, as far as I know, the second most drunk spirit in the United States as well, after vodka, which surprised me.
I didn't know it was after vodka, but yes, I think it is the second one. What is extraordinary to me is of the enormous amount of tequila that is made globally, and an amount that has grown enormously over the years, more than 80% of that is sold abroad. And more than 80% of what's sold abroad is consumed in the US specifically. So over 60% of all tequila in the world is drunk in the United States.
That's unsurprising and yet still pretty shocking.
Now, you must say that we're not necessarily experts on the matter of tequila. We're not, tequila sommeliers, or say, or producers of any sort. But I think, in a way, we're both, as many Mexicans are, spiritually connected to the drink by virtue of the number and, magnitude of parties that we've had with tequila.
I would remind people to go listen to our podcast on why Mexicans are so good at partying to get an idea of where tequila lies in this Mexican national identity.
I remember a few years back on one of our many trips to the Tenampa Cantina in Mexico City, an amazing place. If you haven't been, do go, with Alex. And much mariachi had been sung. It was 1:30 in the morning, much tequila had been drunk, and it was time to leave. We'd agreed on it. I just popped over to the toilet very quickly. And when I came back, what do you think was waiting for me? Well, of course, a bottle of tequila held by yours truly, Alex Gonzalez. And we stuck around for another 2 hours until they kicked us out of the Tenampa.
But we really enjoyed it because we ended up drinking that bottle with the mariachis themselves, which was a wonderful experience. They even lent your wife their violin, and she stood on a table and played it. That's the sort of effect one expects from tequila.
Exactly. And maybe the other reason why particularly I'm sort of spiritually connected to the drink, is that I got married in the city of Tequila, another big party that Alex obviously attended.
Yes, I did go. And one of the things we did while you did a bunch of rehearsals was we nipped over to the Jose Cuervo Tequila Museum. And what was interesting is when you think of tequila, the town of Tequila, you think of the drink. And of course, we'll be talking about denomination of origin and all that sort of special stuff that makes tequila very unique to a certain part of Mexico. But what was interesting to me was when you turn up at the tequila factory, it's really just a tourist attraction. A very small percentage of the total tequila made by Jose Cuervo and by tequileros generally is made in Tequila. The rest of it is manufactured across the state of Jalisco and in other places because the importance of the town has now been transferred from manufacturing to tourism, which I think is an interesting microcosm of the evolution of tequila over the years.
Certainly. The grand majority of tequila today is produced in Los Altos de Jalisco, which is further away from tequila, because in Los Altos you have a slightly different climate and you get more sugar in the agave, and it produces a tequila that is more palatable to most people. But Tequila City is where it all began historically, or where the great haciendas used to be. And it remains sort of the spiritual heart of tequila, the drink. So today we're going to be delving into Tequila, how it became so linked to Mexico and Mexican identity, and how it's grown into this colossal phenomenon of partying, but also how it has increasingly in recent years become the drink of choice of the world elite.
Salud.
Tequila is undoubtedly one of the things that comes to mind most often, if not first, when people talk about Mexico and think of Mexico and Mexican identity. But what's funny about that to me is that many of the most renowned tequilas in the world are not owned by Mexican firms. Now, granted, the largest player, who produces 3 times as much as the next guy, Jose Cuervo, is owned by Mexicans, and the family behind them, in turn, controls several other major brands. But the majority of the top 10 selling brands are controlled by foreign firms, in turn controlled by foreign capital. We're talking names such as Don Julio, Patron, or Espolón. However, that is a relatively modern phenomenon. Long before the entrance of all these very global firms, tequila was widely drunk in Mexico, and it has been drunk in Mexico for a very, very long time. So tequila actually dates back to the Spanish times. When you read a little about tequila, you read quite a bit of nonsense, though, on how it's actually an ancestral sort of Mesoamerican drink. Because the Aztecs used to drink pulque, which does come from agave.
Although a different sort of agave, no?
It is a different sort of agave, and it is a completely different drink. So the pulque is a fermented drink that comes from extracting the sort of goo that lives at the heart of the agave plant. Tequila is made from a different agave plant, but also in a very different way. They cut off all of the leaves, and then they bake the thing at the heart, which is called the la piña, the pineapple, because it looks like a pineapple. And then they squish it, and then the juice that comes out of that, not a goo, the juice is fermented and distilled. There's nothing done with the fermentation product per se. It has to be distilled, and that's where we get tequila from.
And if you head to the museum or any palenque, which is what they call these pretty rudimentary tequila making places, you can try the roasted agave heart, and it almost tastes like toffee. It's like roasted and really concentrated sugars. It's delicious. It's almost a shame to make a drink out of it because it's really yummy on its own.
It really is. I don't know why they haven't tried to capitalize on that, because like the way in which you eat it is similar to the way you eat sugarcane. So, something could be done with that, but maybe tequila is just too profitable. But it is certainly delicious. Now, tequila, even though it doesn't have this sort of Mesoamerican ancestral component some people try to talk about, it must be said that it is a profoundly Mexican drink in the sense that it is the product of miscegenation, as is everything that is profoundly Mexican. The only reason that a drink was made out of agaves in the first place was because there was this knowledge from Mesoamerican times that alcohol could be made from the agave. Now, the idea to do any distilling, we don't know exactly where it came from. Some people say it was Filipino sailors that came to the west coast of Mexico. Some people say it was the Spanish directly who brought it. Who knows? But the whole point is that the rest of the world came to Mexico and the cultures mixed and produced the wonder that is tequila. But the massive popularization of tequila as, this proud symbol of Mexicanness is something that's a lot more recent. It's a 20th century phenomenon. So here's a question for you, Alex. In the 1910 celebration of the centenary of Mexico's independence, what do you think they drank at the celebration?
Well, I know Porfirio Diaz was still in power, and he loved the French, so probably champagne or something. Bubbles, champers.
Definitely champagne. What else?
Oh, give me a clue. Was it Mexican?
Absolutely not. Not a single Mexican drink was served at the Centenary of Independence other than some hot chocolate. There was Chardonnay from Chablis. There was Red Bordeaux from none other than Mouton Rothschild. And there was dry sherry.
Delish.
But not a drop
Although
of tequila.
very un-Mexican.
Thoroughly. The menu is extraordinary. It is the most French thing you've ever seen. And the music was almost entirely Austrian waltzes.
Oh, so that's a party I would have wanted to go to.
Definitely. It does sound extraordinary. One of the accounts I read talked about over 10,000 people, I don't know where they fit them, attending the party at the National Palace. So it sounds like a great party, but it's not a very Mexican party.
Yeah, one does want to crank up the Mexican waltzes every once in a while.
Danzón número dos, for example. But of course, after the revolution, 10 years of a very bloody war, the new government is trying to not only create a new sort of model for the country, but a new identity for the country. And Porfirio Diaz, it wasn't unique to him, of course, it was very common all over the world, but he tried to emulate Europe in as much as he could, and particularly France. So the people that come after the revolution are trying to create a very Mexican identity and sort of find Mexican symbols for this new, very Mexican Mexico. And there's many symbols that are propped up, but one of the most important one is tequila. Tequila before had been associated for a very long time with a sort of, country bumpkin kind of person. It was the drink of the uneducated masses along with pulque. But already since the 1930s, you start seeing tequila portrayed in a very different way. Jorge Negrete, for example, one of the key sort of actors from Mexico's golden age of cinema, has several scenes where he's drinking tequila. There's the famous song of Tequila con Limón. And it's just part of this broader sort of romanticized view of, Mexican heritage and the Mexican countryside. And it works. People buy it. In great part because Mexican films became quite popular and people like Jorge Negrete were famous and respected in many places, including the US.
It's an interesting moment in history because, again, the Second World War comes to bear on cultural mores of the time when Mexican filmmaking has its massive golden era, mostly because a lot of Hollywood was too busy making propaganda films or the people were literally out fighting in Germany or in the Pacific Theater. And so you get a lot more interest and a lot more production value in Mexico during those years. And so it must have magnified its cultural impact on both sides of the border.
Definitely. And it's not just, the Second World War doesn't just play a role because of this, but it also plays a role because a lot of the manufacturing, if not all of the manufacturing efforts and power of the US was being directed towards the Second World War. And that includes the production of alcohol, which led to a lot of demand coming from other places. And, well, the closest place, of course, is Mexico. So the Second World War plays a huge role also in increasing the demand for tequila in the United States. This, of course, had already happened since the Prohibition days, when people had to go to Mexico or Canada to get alcohol. One story actually says that the margarita was the product of one of these trips. The margarita was the product of one of these trips.
What is a margarita?
Margarita is a cocktail made with tequila and lime, I think originally with orange liquor as well.
Wow.
But it is one of the most famous cocktails in the world. I read a stat, which I find hard to believe, that 185,000 margaritas are drunk every single day.
That doesn't surprise me, though, because the reason I ask what a margarita is because I've never really had one unless I'm with an American. Whenever I have American colleagues or friends over, they're always going to restaurants and asking for margaritas. And I think, how weird. They're never going to, oh God, they've got one. They've got margaritas at this restaurant that I never would have thought they had margaritas at. But they're catering to this American audience, it turns out.
But it's not only the U.S., it's a global thing. And I think maybe in Mexico we lose sight of just how important tequila is out there. Like, we drink tequila in a very particular way, but tequila is part of the popular imaginary in many parts of the world, and in many cases in the form of a cocktail. Margarita being, of course, the most famous of them all. But there's a second one, and this second one also plays a huge role in the explosion of tequila, and what made tequila this incredibly important drink in the party sort of world, and that is the tequila sunrise.
What's a tequila sunrise?
I'm glad you asked. It's tequila, orange juice, and it's colored with grenadine. So you get this orange sort of glass. It's served in a tall glass, and then you put the drops of the grenadine, and it seems like one of those particularly bloody sunrises. So that's the tequila sunrise.
And was this invented by an American?
Well, it's difficult to know, right? But yes, it is believed that it was invented by Americans in Arizona, I believe. But then that was in the 30s and 40s. But then it becomes very popular again in the 70s because there's a very famous bar in California that's serving it widely. You have to remember, a lot of stars used to travel and live to a degree in Acapulco years prior. So that there's that link already from those times of the American elite, particularly the Hollywood elite, drinking drinking and eating Mexican goods. Acapulco becomes maybe a little bit less relevant in the 70s, but Hollywood remains incredibly powerful, and those people are in California. And Hollywood keeps playing a role because Tequila Sunrise becomes a film in 1988. With Mel Gibson, also a wildly successful film. Before that, the Eagles have a song called Tequila Sunrise. And Mick Jagger apparently had a big role in this because he famously, when he was at the peak of his career, he orders a Tequila Sunrise on TV. And then people all over the world want to have a Tequila Sunrise.
Oh, wow. I mean, it's amazing how this is such an American story. It's a Mexican drink made to bolster Mexican nationalism. And really, the driving force behind it from the mid-20th century onwards is the United States.
I think Porfirio Díaz said it. México tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de Estados Unidos. Mexico so far from God and so close to the United States. For better or for worse, Mexican fate is deeply intertwined with the U.S. And tequila is just one of the many examples of that, right? Now, what follows from the 70s is actually we see one of the negative effects of that sort of intertwined fate, which is Mexico just couldn't keep up with demand. Demand for tequila in the US just explodes in the course of the 70s and 80s. Agaves take a minimum of 6 years to mature into something that can produce tequila. How do you keep up if you need a minimum of 6 years to start producing that additional supply? Well, you water it down. Already in the 60s, to try and face this already increasing demand, there's an agreement reached where some tequila will be allowed, like lower quality tequila, and it will be sold as lower quality, will be allowed to be diluted in such a way that only 70% of the tequila actually comes from agave. The remaining 30% could come from other sugars, right? So in producing alcohol, you need to ferment sugars into alcohol. Agave produces the sugars usually, but agave is difficult to grow. So you can also get the sugars from elsewhere, like, say, sugarcane. By the 1970s, however, those rules had changed. And it was only 51% that needed to be blue agave in order for something to be called tequila. That, of course, lowered the quality of the product because you can just pour in any basically kind of sugar added to this 51% blue agave mix and see what happens. Now, this is a long-standing problem, I think, in Mexico. And I have an example from a very different setting, but also linked to food. Back, I think it must have been around 2014, Enrique Olvera, the very famous chef, the chef of the Puyol, widely regarded as one of the finest restaurants in the world, moved the location of his famous Puyol from its original location at the end of the Polanco neighborhood in Mexico City to another part of the Polanco neighborhood. When he did that, there was an uproar in the neighborhood. There were signs all over the place saying, we can't allow this, Puyol should be somewhere else. And that was because the street to which he moved had very particular zoning rights, and those zoning rights said that they had to be exclusively residential. However, Ricolbert had been allowed to set up his restaurant there. The neighbors of the Polanco neighborhood, a very, very wealthy neighborhood in Mexico, made a huge fuss, and the final decision was that Enrique Olvera could keep his restaurant there. And the way they explained it, the translation is something along the lines of, the great vigor of economic growth and demand in Polanco cannot be stopped and must not be stopped. So they changed the zoning rights for this to meet this excess demand. And of course, with dire consequences in many ways for the people who live there, who had lived there for decades, because that means that the street has become a lot noisier. That, of course, changes the value of the houses and so on. But the point is, Mexico has a problem where when it gets a lot of demand, it's happy to start changing up the rules to meet that demand, not necessarily always taking care of the quality of things.
So you give them an inch and they'll turn 51% of your tequila into sugar water.
Exactly. Now, of course, tequila by that point had become so important and it was so linked to Mexico and Mexicanness, and you had these great families like the owners of Jose Cuervo who demanded, to protect the tequila brand, right? So in 1974, Mexico creates an appellation of origin, basically a set of rules that say that tequila must be protected, and these are the rules behind tequila, and it sort of creates a massive sort of regulation to make sure that tequila follows certain standards and then people abroad can't, copy it and call it tequila. They learned this, of course, from the kings of appellations of origin, the French. And those norms are still in place today. Now, even though in the long run we've seen that they were quite successful, the problem is that this permission to dilute the tequila, which is in part still in place today, but we'll get to that in a second, did an enormous damage to the image of tequila on a global scale. Tequila came to be associated with partying, not the nicest or the classiest form of partying, and with hangovers, massive, terrible hangovers. And it wasn't an incorrect association, to be fair. When you pour in 49% of pretty much any sugar you want, what you get isn't necessarily the highest quality stuff. And that hurts your body, and your body complains. So here's a bit of a public service announcement. I did say that these rules that allow only 51% of tequila to come from agave are still in place. But that tequila is called a mixto tequila, a mixed tequila. Okay, and they need to say something to that effect on the label. So when you're out there and drinking tequila, as you should, because it's a wonderful drink, just make sure to look for something on the label that says 100% agave azul, azul agave, blue Weber tequila, something of the sort, which refers to the type of agave, and it just says that 100% of that tequila has been made with that agave.
A handy saying for that is, if it's blue, come on through. And if it's sugar water, it's lambs to the slaughter.
I think we should make a jingle out of that. Now, something that's important is tequila doesn't need to be made only in Tequila, as we mentioned, or in Los Altos de Jalisco. It can be made in a range of states. And the second thing is, there's tons of styles out there. So mixto is one of the styles, and that one you should probably stay away from. That's mostly designed for like cocktails and not particularly the highest quality of cocktails. But the style of tequila that's out there doesn't necessarily reflect the quality, so long as it's 100% blue agave. You have tequilas that are blanco, añejos, reposados, which basically speaks to how much time they've spent in barrels. And that's really just a matter of preference. The barrel can enhance the quality, or it can also detract from the quality, depending on how it's been made. So just remember, 100% blue agave, and you'll be fine. Now, while styles are a very personal thing, quality is a little bit less subjective. And quality in tequila has been increasing now for quite some time. This is not just tequila. As we came into the 2000s, the new millennium, there was a lot of, there were a lot of hopes, a lot of fears at the time. And all over the world, there was a talk of how the new millennium was going to be about automation. It was going to be about mass production. And many people were very smart to see that would mean that things that were made with craft and artisanally were going to be in high demand. You see this in wine, you see this in clothing, but you see this, of course, also in tequila. And I think particularly so in tequila. Now, there's a lot of reasons why tequila shifted towards higher quality, not just, the trends. There's the Consejo Regulador de the Tequila Regulatory Council, who governs the AOC and who's done a wonderful job of ensuring that quality in Mexico and abroad. There's a huge international component, mostly American component to this, where celebrities, say, for example, George Clooney, Carlos Santana, the Rock Johnson, so many people have heavily invested in tequila. I think George Clooney recently sold Casa Amigos, his brand of tequila, for $700 million, plus an option for a further $300 million. So there's big investments here. And of course, they've used their image to make sure that these investments are successful, and they've been very good at it. But it's not just the US. I was recently, as one does, in the city of Stade in Switzerland, notoriously luxurious city. And in every bar that I went to and every wine store liquor store that I passed, they were selling tequila. And not just tequila, but the most expensive tequilas out there. And they were front and center. So tequila has grown in popularity all over the world.
I remember very clearly seeing alongside Rolex and the Ralph Lauren ads at the US Open recently, front and center again was an advert for Jose Cuervo. And you've got the closest thing Americans have to royalty at this place, with the highest level of luxury brands being advertised alongside these pretty standard tequila brands, which shows that even middling tequila is on a par with high-level brands.
Certainly, and you see that also in all sorts of events. It's not just the U.S. Open. You see it at horseback riding events. You see it at sailing regattas. It's a thing. Tequila has in many ways become the drink of the elite, on par with the likes of cognac, Armagnac, and whiskey.
Now, unravel this chicken and egg situation for me. Did tequila become prestigious and then was adopted by George Clooney, or is it the other way around?
I think it is definitely very chicken and eggy. It kind of like but it's more like a pinball kind of thing. There's like a back and forth here. I remember in the early 2000s, before the likes of George Clooney invested, Carlos Santana had already invested in what I continue to think is the best tequila I've ever tried. I haven't tried it in a while, so I might change my mind. But the Casa Noble brand. And I think it talks to this much broader sort of move towards artisanal and high value craftsmanship that happened in the early 2000s for all sorts of things. And tequila has the potential to create a great product. So I think anyone who already drank tequila and who understood the potential of tequila, seeing this trend, and if they had the money, it was an obvious investment.
And I guess it fits in with the culture and like the scenery of Hollywood and California more broadly, or Southern California, because it's very much a drink that fits with the environment. Like whiskey and rum, that feels more tropical. The other feels like it should belong in the Highlands of Scotland. Tequila sort of fits in Hollywood.
Yeah, definitely. And I think linked to that as well, we can't deny the huge influence and growing influence that Mexico has culturally in the United States. I was recently in San Francisco and San Diego, where I hadn't been in quite some time. And Spanish has always been widely spoken in California, but I was astounded at just how much Spanish I heard. There were some neighborhoods where I heard more Spanish than I did English. And some of these were quite wealthy neighborhoods. So the weight that Mexico has on the United States culturally, particularly in a place like California, I think had a big sort of, and has had a big influence. Now, there's other elements as well, right? We can't deny that there's growing inflation, and there has been for quite some time. The growing wealth inequality, you have the massive dot-com crash, you have the 2000, even bigger 2008 crash, you have the pandemic, and that has put more money in fewer people's hands. These people like luxury goods. So there's a higher demand for luxury goods, tequila becoming more and more luxurious every year as well. But then there's a third thing, which is something that saddens me deeply, which is that the world is becoming more boring.
I blame Gen Z.
Oh, I do too, certainly. What are we talking about here? Well, alcohol demand is falling sharply across all categories. Speaking of wine, for example, it is now the third year in a row that wine consumption falls. 3 years ago, it reached for the first time pre-1961 levels. Then it fell more, and then it fell again. And this is happening all over the world.
And all for what? So that people can live happier, healthier lives? Rubbish.
Absolute nonsense. Now, there is something positive about this, of course, because we're saying that, alcohol consumption is falling. So, but at the same time, this is great for tequila and explains the rise of tequila. Well, the good thing is people are drinking less, but mostly less of the shitty stuff. They're drinking less of the 49% sugarcane tequila and more of the nice stuff. They're drinking less of the bad wine and the bad beer and moving towards the better made stuff.
So maybe the world isn't getting more boring. Perhaps the world is getting more sophisticated, at least when it comes to tequila.
Yeah. And in the case of tequila, that is most certainly the case.
The stats really do support this. You can see tequila titans like Jose Cuervo losing a lot of their sales in the United States and across the world as alcohol consumption plummets, especially in their mid and lower tier products. But they're still investing heavily in the higher level stuff because that continues to be enormously profitable. I mean, ultimately, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but ultimately, even though a tequila may be better or worse, it still takes 6 years to grow, and it mustn't be a much more expensive process when you make something better and when you've got a luxury tequila versus a mid-tier tequila. Like, the markup must be sizable.
Yeah, definitely. I remember talking about this with someone specifically talking about Bordeaux wines, and they were arguing that taking away sort of like the marketing component, that the cost for making, he didn't actually have the numbers in hand, but he knew a lot of the chateau owners. And he was saying that the cost of making one of these great bottles that sell for $800, $1,500 a bottle is maybe $35, maybe $45 when you actually look at the per unit item. So of course the markup is outstanding, and that's the case of wine, of course. But in the case of tequila, it's essentially the same. What changes when you move from a low quality tequila to a high quality tequila? Mostly you need to focus on growing great agaves. So you might lose a little bit of yield because, like, by that I mean volume of agave, because you only focus on the best quality agaves, not just quantity of agaves. And from there on out, you just need to put a lot more time and effort into making sure that the process, the distillation and fermentation process, happens the way you want it to happen. Control temperatures, control for microbes, these kinds of things. But in the highly industrialized world that we live in, that has become quite cheap. So of course, profits are going up.
So really, it might be 10 times more expensive to make a fancy tequila versus a mid-tier one, but you can charge 100 times more.
Exactly. Now, about 15 years ago, there was a move within the tequila industry to focus on basically prettier bottles. They started selling really, really expensive tequilas. The quality had gone up, but they focused more on the marketing. Eventually, I believe it was Don Julio who came out with their crystal tequila, pushing a really high quality tequila. And the ad, which was brilliant, said, "Let's talk about tequila." And they just sold it in a nice, simple, standard bottle, nothing fancy. And they kept the really high markup, the really high price. But it was a sort of call to attention of we need to focus on the quality above all. So yes, while markups are extraordinary, it is ultimately driven these days by ultra high quality production. And that, I suppose, is wonderful.
And the marketing's changed as well. Before, the marketing was go get drunk in Cancun or at spring break and have a terrible hangover as a teenager. Now the marketing is we're going toe-to-toe with the best whiskeys and cognacs in the market. And the marketing, therefore, must be more expensive and very different in kind. It's the difference between having a Jose Cuervo logo on an umbrella at a party beach in Cancun versus having it at the US Open.
Yeah, definitely. So when I say that the marketing department had won and now we've shifted to quality, the marketing department's still in charge, certainly, because otherwise, how can you justify this enormous markup? You need to sell an image in the same way that the great whiskeys and wines of the world do. But at least there's quality behind. At least there is a lot of substance behind. Now, the problem is with this massive rise in profits came a massive rise in an attempt to supply tequila. If you see demand grow enormously, you see deals for $700 million for Casamigos, as I mentioned previously, then you want to ride that wave. And in the past few years, massive amounts of agaves were planted to try and be part of this growth. And that is, of course, because up until 2022, tequila production was growing like crazy, trying to keep up with demand. It reached an extraordinary 651 million liters. Now, let's put that into context. In 2020, it is believed the production was somewhere between 420 and 480 million. So we're talking an increase in over 30% in production and sales. However, by 2024, production had fallen to 495 million. So from 650 to around 500. And it is expected to continue to fall in 2025.
Which is terrible news for the agricultural workers because they have made enormous investments in a crop that takes 6 years to grow, only to find that when their investment matures, it's now worthless.
Yes, that's a serious problem. And the Consejo Regulador de Tequila, along with a bunch of other organizations, governmental and otherwise, have tried to stop. They believe that the crisis of excess supply of agave will be resolved by 2030, but that remains to be seen.
And that's because people started noticing the decline in demand in 2024. So no one's planting as much agave. And so all those agaves that are being planted now will mature by 2030, and so demand and supply and demand will have stabilized by then. Is that why?
Basically. I mean, that in addition to a bunch of initiatives that were implemented, one of them, for example, was issuing sort of certifications that you needed to have in order to be able to sell your agaves, because people were sort of felling trees everywhere to be able to grow agaves because they wanted to ride the wave. Years ago, they implemented these initiatives, and that slowed down some of the planting. The pain hasn't really hit yet, I think, because obviously, since it takes 6 years for minimum for the agave to mature to production levels, the crisis of excess supply is only going to begin to happen in the next few years, right? Because the massive rise really happened right around COVID, and those agaves haven't matured yet. But farmers are really going to feel the pain in the next few years, all the way through to 2030.
And tequila has a bit of an unfair disadvantage when it comes to other Mexican distilled drinks like mezcal, because it's ultimately a monocrop. You can only use blue agave, as opposed to mezcal, which is a very similar production process, and yet it uses different sorts of agave that are native across different parts of Mexico. And so you can definitely see how this betting on one single crop for one specific drink that is now falling in popularity has really hit these very specific farmers. Yeah. Speaking of mezcal, it's interesting. I'd be interested to see whether tequila is being hit from within Mexico because of the sudden popularity of mezcal becoming the sort of go-to drink for sophisticated hipsters in New York. People don't offer you tequila at a nice trendy bar. They'll offer you a mezcal cocktail, which, as I said, similar process to tequila, different geographies and different approaches to production, which I think must be affecting consumption. And as the trend moves along, so you had this 20th century trend with the tequila sunrise, I think maybe there's a bit of a sunset going on for tequila as people stop drinking as much and as other Mexican distilled drinks start to really take flight, like mezcal and like sotol.
I mean, it's a big question of where is tequila going to go from here. Obviously, also for sustainability reasons, you want to minimize monocrops in general. And when you see the agave fields, they're a beauty to behold, because the blue agave is called the blue agave for a reason. It's this beautiful deep blue color, and it's usually planted against red soil, so it just looks outstanding. But also, when you see it, you realize just how much vegetation, native vegetation, has been lost in order to have this one crop. That should be, I don't know if it is today, but that should be a driver away from more and more tequila. But as you say, also, of course, the demand of other liquors like sotol and mezcal. My bet is the biggest driver or determinant of where tequila will go from here is that the boringness trend is going to continue. By all accounts, alcohol consumption is forecasted to continue to fall globally. And it hasn't hit Mexico that much yet. Mexico is still a heavy drinking country, but it's bound to hit Mexico soon enough. And the trend is very, very visible already in that massive consumer that is the US.
Beyond all this dullification and its competition with other Mexican fermented drinks, what I'm pretty certain about, at least in the medium term, I don't think tequila as a brand that represents Mexicanness globally is going anywhere. It's a bit like in our podcast about the 5 most famous Mexicans. I think tequila's got everything. It's got the brand power. It's a sort of relatively unified product as opposed to mezcal. And it's increasingly regulated to keep its quality on the up and up. So despite, competition with mezcal and sotol, despite people drinking less, I'm pretty certain that tequila will continue to be one of Mexico's main representatives across the globe for the foreseeable future.
And if nothing else, I think we'll continue to order it every time we're at the Nampa.
Cheers to that.
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Homorod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking about Mexican politics, culture, society, economics.
And its very many wonderful elixirs. Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist and give us a like.
And a comment. Till then, toodaloo.